Okay, for this section of the lecture on states of consciousness, I'd like to talk about drugs. So drugs are a way to alter our consciousness. So let's talk about some terms that are associated with drugs. Here they are right here. Physical addiction. So the problem with drugs is that when we put the drugs in our body, the drugs are acting like neurotransmitters. They're either mimicking the activity of brain chemicals or they are blocking the activity of brain chemicals. So most all psychoactive drugs, they simply look like a neurotransmitter. So I have this picture here because this is how I teach it in class. This is my analogy of how it works is, let's say, here I'm going to draw something on here. So let's say that this right here is, I'm sorry, let's say that this one is dopamine. Okay, so dopamine is the neurotransmitter of pleasure and satisfaction. So almost all addicting drugs work on the neurotransmitter dopamine. We could say this one would be serotonin. So I think a lot of you understand that the I could write one as endorphins. I could write one as acetylcholine. I could write one as epinephrine, norepinephrine. So each one of these would represent a different neurotransmitter. So what happens is when a neuron releases a neurotransmitter, then it goes into a receptor site like this, and it fills the receptor site, and it turns it like a key, and then it goes back into the cell that released it. That's how some of them work. So with physical addiction is what happens is the body is always trying to maintain homeostasis. So I'm going to write that. The body is always trying to maintain homeostasis, which is an internal balance. So when we use drugs, so like let's say cocaine, let's just try cocaine. Cocaine blocks the reabsorption of dopamine from the neuron that released it. So usually dopamine gets released from a neuron, it attaches to the receptor sites of another neuron, and then it gets drawn back into the cell that released it. But when you take cocaine, what cocaine does is it blocks this, and so this stays here and keeps tapping. So usually it would just tap here once, boom. But by blocking it from being taken back into the cell that released it, it's going like this, boom, 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 boom. So this receptor site right here becomes flooded with dopamine because the cocaine is blocking the reuptake. So since this is becoming flooded, what the body does is it says, oh my goodness, we're going to stop releasing dopamine because we're going to try to maintain homeostasis here. And so we're going to stop releasing our own natural dopamine. And so when the cocaine wears off, then what happens is the body goes to a state of withdrawal, which is usually the opposite of what the drug does. It goes into depression, you don't have energy, because the body has tried to maintain the homeostasis by stopping releasing its natural dopamine. So by this receptor site becoming flooded because of the use of drug, now the body is actually probably going to need some more cocaine just to feel right because the body's trying to maintain homeostasis, so it stops releasing its own natural dopamine, and so you need the cocaine just to have a regular amount of dopamine in there. So that's physical addiction, when the body needs the drug in order to function physically. Now let's see about this tolerance thing though. Look, if this right here gets flooded with lots of dopamine, then what the body can do is the body can simply make another star right here, another receptor site. And so now you don't need just enough dopamine for one star, you need enough dopamine for two stars. So again, we're getting to this physical addiction. Now, if you stop the drug, and now the synapse is not being flooded with dopamine, then what will eventually happen is, let's see if there's an eraser on here. Yeah, there is. Okay. So what will eventually happen is, oh, but it's not going to let me erase. Oh, yes, it does. Okay. So what eventually happens is that when you have the excess of dopamine stopped, then that receptor site will go away. But you have to be willing to go through the withdrawal experience of not having enough dopamine to be there. And it's really, really draining, really physical. So there we go, tolerance, when you need more and more of the drug to get the same high or just to avoid withdrawal. Look, go back to this. again, is if, as the way of the body to maintain homeostasis, is by saying, okay, there's lots of dopamine at the synapse. Let's make another receptor site for dopamine to compensate, to bring this back to internal balance. By creating another receptor site, then now you need more and more of the drug to fill 2 stars instead of just 1 star receptor site. So some drugs will create a tolerance because the body will add additional receptor sites to deal with the flooding. So I hope that I've explained this to you. Is drugs work, okay? Drugs work by altering the activities of neurotransmitters. Okay, so I'm just going to write that. Neurotransmitters, and the neurotransmitters are brain chemicals. So drugs act by altering the activity of our natural brain chemicals. And what they do is they either mimic the activity of a neurotransmitter or they block the activity of a neurotransmitter. But that will change the way the receptor sites are set up in your brain. And so eventually a lot of drugs will cause physical addiction. Not all drugs, but some drugs will cause physical addiction. Whoops. And this physical addiction is when you need the drug just to be able to function normally. Then I'm explaining tolerance is when you flood the synapse with lots and lots of a particular neurotransmitter, then for some neurotransmitters the body compensates by adding more receptor sites. So now you need more and more just to get the same high. The withdrawal is the physical symptoms that the body experiences once the drug is removed. So now you stop taking the drug, but now you have these 2 receptor sites that have to be filled when normally your body could only do 1. So you're going to experience kind of the opposite effects of whatever the drug does. So if you felt really good about something, really happy and high, then you're probably going to go into depression. So you usually get the opposite effect. And then again, that's related to homeostasis as well, because when the body goes really high one way, the way the body tries to maintain is it tries to bring you back down. So take away the drug that's making you high, and then the body is attempting to bring you back down anyway. It's a deep, deep depression, what you get with cocaine. So I covered these 3 terms. Hopefully you get an understanding of how they're working in the brain. But the worst one is actually psychological addiction. See, physical addiction, if you're willing to just go through the painful withdrawal, that's okay. But the worst one is this one, the psychological addiction. It's because you believe that you need the drug, and that's the absolute worst. This is the one that it's really hard to kick, because if a person believes that they need the drug and they say, this is what makes me happy, this is the only thing that makes life worth living, even if they get through the painful physical things, they still have that notion in their head. So this is even though I say to you something like marijuana is not physically addicting, but it's very psychologically addicting. And that's the worst one, because now you have to really get the person to stop believing that they need the drug. So what I'm going to do now is I think that instead of me going through all the drugs on this next one is I'm just going to ask you to read the section in your book on drug classification, because he did a great job on explaining them. And I would like you to be able to classify the drugs, and on the test I'd like you to be able to tell me a little bit about the drugs. Okay, so that will end this lecture portion on drugs. That's all I wanted to say, but I'd like you to use your book to go over the drugs that he goes over and be able to classify them and tell me a little bit about their effects.